Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 200 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, we're going to do an analysis of the Alex Pretti shooting, which, as most of you probably know, took place in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, just a couple weeks ago. And the shooting there ignited, of course, an intense debate over law enforcement use of force, the Second Amendment, and what the role of federal officials is and should be in enforcing immigration policies. Of course, this was just very soon after the shooting of Renee Good, which also drew a lot of controversy. Bring a little bit of a perspective, I think, to what took place there with the Alex Pretti shooting, and provide a little bit of nuance that I think is lost in a lot of the online discussion. I think there are many people who have good analysis, making excellent points, but their commentary, I think, is colored by their preferred outcome, by what their political bias may be. And frankly, and I'll just say this at the outset, I don't know for sure whether or not this shooting was justified. I don't think it should have happened, but that's not the standard. I think that this was a comedy of errors, so to speak. I think that Alex Pretti made some grave errors. I think that law enforcement made some serious mistakes, but that doesn't mean necessarily that this was murder, and vice versa. It doesn't mean necessarily that this was justified. So I want to talk through some of the legal standards here for police use of deadly force, what we see in some of the video, and I'll point out some contrasting takes by people who I think are very well versed in the use of deadly force. What I can say for certain is that the response to this by the Trump administration was horrific. This was not a Second Amendment case. It should never have been about the Second Amendment. And the Trump administration, I think, in an effort to paint Alex Pretti as an unsympathetic person, brought the Second Amendment into the discussion by demonizing the fact that he had a firearm, number one, and by demonizing the type of firearm that he had. And I think that has very little to do with, I can say the Second Amendment has nothing to do with why Alex Pretti was shot. Of course, the fact that he had a firearm came into the picture in terms of the use of force analysis. But there was nothing unlawful about the fact that he was carrying a firearm. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit as well. And I hope by the end of this, you have a clearer understanding about the issues in this case, the complexity of the issues, and why this is not a clear-cut case. This is not a situation where we can say this was clearly justified or not. So with that in mind, let's set the stage for what happened in this incident and where some of the controversy stems from. Alex Pretti was, of course, a 37-year-old ICU nurse and a licensed concealed carrier, and he was shot by federal agents during a confrontation in Minneapolis on the morning of January 24th, 2026. He was, by some accounts, present as an observer, by other accounts, present as an agitator at an immigration enforcement operation involving U.S. Border Patrol and ICE agents. And according to multiple eyewitness videos, Pretti was standing in the street filming the agents with his cell phone as they detained or were attempting to detain another individual. Although I'm not aware that the person they were attempting to detain, and we'll see this in the video, I don't think that person was ever, in fact, arrested. But nevertheless, in the footage, an agent, you can see, shoves a woman wearing a white coat. And for those of you watching this by video, we'll play some of the video here in just a moment. But the agent pushes this woman to the ground near Pretti, and Pretti steps toward the agent in what looks like an attempt to intervene or to protect the woman, and he even puts a hand out in front of the officer, and it looks like he touches the officer's side, and he makes physical contact with the agent. And this is a crucial moment we'll revisit later. Seeing this, the agent moves to arrest Pretti for interfering with his operation, his attempt to, detain or to clear out the street. And almost immediately, the officer that Pretti touched pepper sprayed Pretti in the face with OC spray, causing him to step away and put his hand up, and this is Pretti, trying to shield himself from the spray. And within seconds, multiple agents swarm Pretti. They tackle Pretti to the ground, wrestling him in the street as bystanders take video and shout. You can hear there's a lot of noise in the background, which also plays into the use of force analysis. But during the struggle, agents discovered that Pretti was armed at some point. And it's not clear which agents were aware that he was armed, but he was armed. And you can see in the video that one of the agents removes the firearm from Pretti's holster on his waistband. And at some point, you can hear presumably an agent yelling, "Gun." And it's not clear from the video which agent that was. But it's clear, I think, from the video that the officers or the agents successfully disarmed Pretti. And in fact, the video clearly shows an officer pulling a handgun from Pretti's waistband and stepping away from the pile of agents holding Pretti down. And moments later, almost contemporaneously with the disarmament of Pretti, another agent shoots Pretti while he's face down on the ground, presumably with just a cell phone in his hand. Roughly 10 shots were fired between two agents, striking Pretti multiple times. And importantly, the video evidence indicates that Pretti was face down on his hands and knees, essentially on all fours at the moment the first shots hit him. And he did not appear at any time to be holding a gun or reaching for his gun. Nevertheless, one agent opened fire into Pretti's back, and another agent also opened fire, under the belief, presumably, that Pretti still posed a lethal threat. Pretti later died at the scene. The official narrative from the Trump administration immediately after the fact initially painted Pretti as a violent aggressor or a domestic terrorist who tried to assassinate officers. Stephen Miller, White House Deputy Chief of Staff, alleged on social media that a would-be assassin tried to murder federal law enforcement. And Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem claimed Pretti was brandishing a gun and intended to massacre law enforcement. These portrayals, I think, tried to control the narrative before the investigation had even begun, inflaming tensions and making this about a case about the Second Amendment and distracting from the real issue. In what appears to me to be an effort to distract from criticism of immigration enforcement tactics and policy. In other words, the initial rush to label Pretti as a dangerous terrorist, I think, backfired because there was a great deal of response from the likes of the Second Amendment Foundation, Firearms Policy Coalition, Gun Owners of America, and even the NRA. And this whiplash in the narrative underscored how clear and contested the facts were in the immediate aftermath of the use of this deadly force against Alex Pretti. The central question here is not whether or not you have the right to carry a firearm at a protest. You are. You are not permitted to carry a firearm in the commission of a crime, but that's a separate issue. The central question here is, were the agents legally justified in shooting Alex Pretti? And to understand that, we need to understand the legal standards governing the police use of deadly force, and then examine whether those standards were met given what was known and what remains, importantly, unknown about the incident. In the United States, law enforcement officers are governed by the principle of objective reasonableness when it comes to using deadly force. This principle, stemming from U.S. Supreme Court cases such as Graham v. Connor and Tennessee v. Garner, asks whether an officer's decision to use lethal force was reasonable given the totality of the circumstances at the moment of the shooting. Officers do not have to be perfect in their judgment, but they must make reasonable decisions in split-second, tense situations. In practice, an officer is justified in using deadly force if he or she has a reasonable belief that a suspect poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm to the officer or others. This standard is not evaluated with 20 hindsight from the calm of an office days later with slowed down video, zoomed in with stills. It's judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene with only the knowledge that officer had at the time. In other words, even if it later turns out that the suspect wasn't actually armed or dangerous, a shooting can still be legally justified if in that moment would have thought the suspect was about to cause deadly harm or serious bodily injury. And it's crucial to note here that under Tennessee versus Garner, deadly force is deemed unreasonable if the suspect poses no immediate threat to the officers or others. Once a threat is neutralized, the justification for continued lethal force disappears. In practical terms, if a suspect has been effectively subdued or is no longer actively threatening anyone, an officer must cease using deadly force. This principle will loom large in our analysis of the Pretti shooting, as we'll see here momentarily, where we have to consider, of course, whether at each moment of the encounter, Pretti posed an imminent threat that warranted being shot. Every shot has to be justified. Applying these standards to the Pretti case means the key issue is, did the agents who fired believe that Alex Pretti was about to use deadly force against them or others? And if they did, was that belief reasonable given what they knew at the time? If yes, and if that belief was grounded in specific actions or observations that made the threat appear imminent, then legally their actions could be deemed justified. If no, for instance, if Pretti was effectively subdued and no longer a threat when the shots were fired, then shooting him would not meet the legal necessity threshold. With that framework in mind, we'll watch a little bit of the video here and we'll discuss. Here I'm going to be discussing, obviously, from my own perspective, but also from some of the perspectives I've heard from experts in the field. I've considered, and I'll link to these, of course. I've considered the analysis by John Correa with active self-protection, of Andrew Branca with the law of self-defense, of Rob Pincus, who was quoted heavily in a USA Today article, and Amy Swearer, who wrote a great article for the National Review. I'll link to all of those resources and all the other resources that I can think of that I considered in my analysis here. But the other part that's important to keep in mind here is that there's this objective reasonableness standard that we have to consider, but there's also the burden of proof. In a criminal case, the prosecution has to prove each element of a crime charged beyond a reasonable doubt. And where self-defense is at issue, they have to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. Here, even if the officers were mistaken, for instance, about whether Pretti was actually armed and presenting a deadly threat when he was shot, if the officer's perception was reasonable, although mistaken, their self-defense claim may still provide a defense if the prosecution cannot disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. As long as their perceptions and their actions were reasonable, there's a lot of debate about whether or not their perceptions were reasonable and about whether or not their use of force was proportional to the face that and if not, then the prosecution would be able to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt, potentially. Now, we don't know whether or not there will be criminal charges here. There is, I think, substantial investigation left to be completed. I think there are too many unknowns here to make a definitive statement or determination about whether or not the force was justified. But the other framework or standard that's important to keep in mind is not just the criminal one, but the civil one. And in a civil case, if someone were to bring a lawsuit or to make claims against the officers or against the agents who were involved here, they would have to prove by preponderance of the evidence whatever claims they were making. So it's a much lower threshold. Preponderance of the evidence just means more likely than not that they were negligent or reckless in some way. And there's some significant hurdles, of course, in a civil case against federal agents, or nearly even with respect to state government actors. If this were state law enforcement, for instance, there would be qualified immunity hurdles. Those exist here as well, even with federal officers. But there's also another quirk, a supremacy clause analysis. And this is an area where I think an overbroad interpretation has extended the supremacy clause into areas it was never intended to cover. But nevertheless, the courts have expanded the use of the supremacy clause here to create significant procedural impediments for claims against federal officers in situations like this. But even in that analysis, where if somebody's sued, for instance, the agents here in state court, the agents could move to have the case removed from state court to federal court under the supremacy clause, but their actions still have to be objective. And the test under the supremacy clause is whether the actions were objectively reasonable under the circumstances, as we've been talking about already, as a reasonable officer would perceive them, and whether they were necessary to the enforcement of federal law. If yes, then federal supremacy could preempt state charges like murder or manslaughter or reckless homicide, or provide an immunity defense. If no, if the answer is that they are not objectively reasonable, the agent's actions were not objectively reasonable, then officers could face state prosecution, civil liability, or other consequences. And I don't want to get into the weeds of supremacy clause litigation here, or supremacy clause analysis, I should say. But one of the controlling cases on the supremacy clause analysis is N. Ray Nagel, and I'll link to that in the show notes. So, with that in mind, with that background about the standard that's used to analyze these situations, let's get into the video in a little more detail. I'm going to play a few clips here, and I'll pause them. And for those of you who are just listening to this and can't see the video, I'll try to narrate the video the best I can. So this first video is from the sidewalk, and in this frame, the agent has already shoved the woman in the white coat that brought about Pretti's initiation of contact with the agent, and Pretti is now on the ground with agents attempting to detain him. So you can see here there are 3 agents at least in direct contact with Pretti, a fourth one with what looks like one hand on him, but Pretti is face down, appears to be on his knees. You can't really see his hands in this frame, but the officer who shoots him first is in the green jacket with the black hat, the black beanie, and apparently looking toward the woman in the white jacket who was pushed initially, not looking at Pretti. The agent who shoots Pretti ultimately turns his attention toward Pretti, has his hand on the agent with the gray jacket who ultimately disarms Pretti. And you can see here, Pretti's in a bit of a turtle position or like a fetal position, knees on the ground. Looks like hands on the ground. It's hard to see his hands still in this position, but it doesn't look like he's reaching back in any way. The officer who shoots him ultimately is looking down. You can't tell for sure where he's looking. Is he looking at his hands? Is he looking at the officer in gray who disarms him? We can't tell that. There's another officer on the right side of the screen here who is beating Pretti in the head with looks like a can of OC spray. You can see at this moment the officer in green with the black beanie draws his firearm. Contemporaneously, it looks like with the moment when the officer in gray removes Pretti's firearm from his holster on his waistband. I'll back that up momentarily. So here the officer who shoots first does not have his firearm out. The officer in the gray, it looks like, has his hand on Pretti's firearm at Pretti's waistband. And it looks like the officer in green who shoots is looking directly down at the firearm in the officer in gray's hand, but it's possible he's trying to locate Pretti's hands. It does not look like that to me in this picture, but we can't tell for sure. He puts his hand on his firearm, and we hear a gunshot. Now, some people think that the officer in gray, the agent here in gray who took Pretti's firearm, negligently discharged Pretti's firearm into the ground as he's running away here. But I don't see that in a lot of the footage. I don't see anything hit the ground. I can't see that it's obvious anyway that there's any kind of recoil, but we can't tell that for sure either. And this, again, is building the narrative. There's so many unknowns here. It appears to me that the first shot comes from the agent in green who shoots Pretti as he's moving into position where the officer in gray was when he removed Pretti's firearm. Now, I'm going to back that up again momentarily. Here we see the officer in green drawing his firearm. You can see Pretti's hand, it looks like, out in front of Pretti here, beneath his face. And it looks like Pretti may move his hand to the rear a bit here. Did the officer in green think that that was the threat, that maybe the phone in his hand was actually a gun or a weapon of some sort? You can hear somebody yell gun. I don't know who yells it. Is it the officer in green who shoots? Is it the officer or the agent in gray who removes the firearm? Is it somebody else entirely? We don't know any of that information. Gunfire. And that's the frame that has been used many times by the media with Alex Pretti back to the officer. Looks like phone still in his right hand, and the officer shoots him in the back as he falls to the ground. The other agents are starting to get out of the way, and Pretti falls to the ground. As the officers back away now, Pretti is on his back, face up, hands to his side. And we don't know here what the officers perceive, what they see here. Do they still believe that the phone that was in Pretti's hand is a weapon of some sort? Or are they simply firing because they haven't had the time to react? There's that gap in their response. But as we'll see here, there's two officers shooting. The officer that we were talking about initially with the black beanie, and the other who was the one who was hitting Pretti in the face with the OC can. And when they quit shooting, it appears that Pretti is no longer moving. Now, I'm going to back that up again. And I want to reiterate here, and this is a point that Andrew Branca emphasizes extensively. The officers are not judged on hindsight bias. They're not judged on 2020 hindsight based on these videos that we're watching on repeat in slow motion and zoomed in some cases. They are judged on what they reasonably perceived at the time. And here, a reasonable officer may have been mistaken that that was a firearm in his hand. That's possible. But we simply don't know. And there's a lot of information that we don't have. What does body cam footage show, if anything? What do witness accounts show, if anything? What do the agents themselves have to say? Who actually yelled gun? Those are all things that matter and go into the analysis. And I want to say here, it's possible that the initial shots on Pretti were justified based on a reasonable mistake. I'm not sure that they are, but I struggle to see how these subsequent shots after Pretti is on his back are justified, because there's a delay in the action here. And this is drawn out in a CNN video, which I normally don't trust CNN, but their video, I think, draws out the fact that we hear a pause in the shooting. You can't see that in this video, but those subsequent shots would also have to be justified based on a reasonable belief that the officers were facing an immediate threat of death or grave bodily harm. And maybe that's there, but I struggle to see that. If you want the strongest steelman case for that, Andrew Branca certainly makes that case. I think the strongest case for that is the first 3 or 4 shots, but the subsequent 5 or 6, I think, are tougher to justify. So here's the slowed down version. And you can tell that this is a chaotic environment. You hear whistles, you hear yelling. All that factors into what a reasonable officer would have done in the situation. But you can see the officer in gray, hand on Pretti's waistband, takes the firearm, and almost immediately the officer in green draws his firearm. It's possible the officer in green did not see the firearm removed from Pretti. There's a concept called inattentional blindness, where if you're focused on something in a high-stress situation, you tend to block out all other things. It's a form of tunnel vision. And if the officer is focused on his hands here, it's possible he did not see the firearm removed, and it's possible when he heard the word gun that's when he drew his firearm and started shooting. Those are possible. Hard to believe a little bit, in my opinion, but possible. And again, thinking back to the standards, can a prosecutor disprove that beyond a reasonable doubt in the context of a criminal case where self-defense is asserted? I think without additional evidence, that's tough here, especially for, like I said, for the first few shots. Less so, I think, for the subsequent 5 or 6 shots. But in a civil case, if the procedural hurdles are navigated, I think it's easier to prove that the officer acted unreasonably here, by at least by a preponderance of the evidence. Now, he may still have some defenses, but I think the evidence, again, is unclear. But a civil case here, assuming the procedural hurdles and the immunity thresholds are overcome, I have a hard time seeing there not being some liability here. Okay, let's move to a different view for a moment. This is from an angle across the street. So you see here the agent with the brown beanie push the lady in white. And at this point, Pretti has not physically intervened, but he does almost immediately after the agent pushes the woman in white. Bam. The agent pushes the woman in white, and I'm going to back that up again. Pretti has his phone in his hand. The agent pushes the woman, and Pretti puts his hand on the agent's waistband. That interaction, that insertion of Pretti into the situation is what brought about this whole sequence of events. And of course, there were some things that led up to this. The woman was in the street. The officer is trying to get the woman out of the street. But here, it doesn't appear that the woman is in the street. She's in front of a parked car, and the agent appears frustrated and shoves the the woman, and Pretti steps in to what appears to me to try to protect the woman, to try to de-escalate the situation. He doesn't appear to have an aggressive posture. He looks like he's simply putting his hand on the agent's waist. Now, that's incredibly stupid, I think, from Pretti's position. He knows this officer is agitated. He knows this officer is frustrated with this woman. He knows he's armed and in a volatile situation. Now, of course, there's nothing unlawful about him being armed in this situation. But many people are saying that this action by Pretti was a crime. And they're assuming, I think, too much in saying that this was a crime. They're saying that it violates 18 U.S.C. 111 and that he's impeding or obstructing these ICE agents in their official duties. And I think it's possible, yes, because that statute is written so broadly, and I'll put it up here on the screen, but it's not clear. This is 18 U.S.C. 111, assaulting, resisting, or impeding certain officers or employees. And it says, whoever forcibly assaults, resists, opposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with any person designated in section 1114 of this title while engaged in or on account of the performance of official duties shall, where the acts in violation of this section constitute simple assault. And then it goes on under subsection B, whoever in the commission of any acts described in subsection A uses a deadly or dangerous weapon, including a weapon intended to cause death or danger, but that fails to do so by reason of a defective component or inflicts bodily injury, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. Okay. The simple assault, imprisoned up to 8 years. The enhanced penalty if the dangerous weapon is used, which it was not here. He was armed, but it was not used in the commission of the alleged offense. So what people are saying is that he committed an offense that carries a term of imprisonment up to 8 years. And I think what commentators often skim over here is that it requires that the action be committed forcibly. Whoever forcibly assaults, resists, opposes, impedes, intimidates, or interferes with any person. And the definition of forcibly, if you look at federal statute, jury instructions, it's not clear that that's what Pretti did here. So, and I'll link to those jury instructions for those of you who are curious about what the jury instructions say, what the statute says. But I think it's presumptuous to just assume that forcible element is met. And I'll just read here actually from the form, the criminal pattern jury instruction. A forcible assault is an intentional threat or attempt to cause serious bodily injury when the ability to do so is apparent and immediate. It includes any intentional display of force that would cause a reasonable person to expect immediate and serious bodily harm or death. And I just don't think that's present here. I don't think that there is a threat or attempt to cause serious bodily injury, or that the display of force by Pretti here would cause a reasonable person to expect immediate and serious bodily harm or death. So I think the people who are suggesting that Pretti is obviously committing a crime here are getting over their skis a little bit. Maybe, but not obvious by any stretch. And you can see here, after Pretti intervenes, the agent gets out the OC spray, and Pretti immediately goes into sort of a defensive posture by holding up his hand. And then the situation escalates from here, as we saw in the previous video. Now, finally, I'm going to show one more video here, and I know we're going a little long here, so I want to keep this quick. CNN posted this video, and I'm going to link to all of this in the show notes. You'll have a lot to go through here if you haven't already seen these things. But CNN posted a video that shows some of the lead up to this interaction. And you can see I'm into the video quite a bit here. I'm 2 minutes and 50 seconds approximately into the video. And you can see the agent who ultimately shoots Pretti first is walking toward the situation while Pretti is recording the interaction with his phone. So the officer with the tan beanie pushes Pretti. He's left here, and he's going to push the woman in the white jacket, where you can see Pretti steps in, and the agent turns his attention to Pretti, and it escalates from there. Now I'm going to fast forward a bit. Okay. You can see here in this frame, the officer or the agent in the green with the black beanie is turning his attention toward Pretti, which we saw earlier. We saw the agent hitting him in the head with the spray canister. You can see here in this frame again, the officer with the black beanie and the green does not yet have his firearm in his hand. They use these boxes, obviously, to highlight the frames. And again, I want to emphasize, officers are not judged based on 20/20 hindsight and the benefit of slowed down video footage. Sure. But you can see the officer in gray removes the firearm almost contemporaneously with the agent in green drawing his firearm. Now, I can't verify the timing here. They say 1 second. Obviously, this is slowed down footage. That seems about right to me based on the footage I've seen that's not been slowed down. But it's not clear, again, if that first gunshot is from the agent in green or a negligent discharge from the agent in gray who took Pretti's firearm. I think it's from the agent in the green, but that's just my interpretation of the videos. Okay. So Pretti's been shot at least 3, maybe 4 times now. And this is where I'm saying that not only do those first 3 or 4 shots have to be justified, each subsequent shot also has to be justified. And we can't see in this video what the officers see. But from the other angle that we watched earlier, it looked like Pretti was laying flat on his back. Now, we don't know that from this video. I think from the other angles, his hands were to his side, but were they on the ground completely? Were they still moving? We can't tell that. At least I don't think we can. Now, those subsequent shots, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, those are the shots that I think are going to be more problematic. Again, we can't see with certainty what the officer sees here, but there may be additional video. I think additional investigation needs to be done, and I'm not willing, based on the video that I've seen, to say that this was clearly justified or not. My gut instinct is not, but we can't tell that. And again, the state would have to disprove self-defense here beyond a reasonable doubt. So I hope we've given you some food for thought here. This is a terrible situation. I think that there were many mistakes made on both sides. Should Pretti have been intervening with federal law enforcement agents while armed? No, of course that increases his risk level. Should the officers have handled this situation better? I think so. But were their actions objectively unreasonable given the circumstances and the facts that they knew at the time or that they believed at the time? That's not clear either. Like I said, I think additional investigation is clearly needed in this situation. I hope that there is an objective, neutral, unbiased investigation here. I'm not optimistic about that on any level. I don't trust the authorities in Minneapolis to do that in an unbiased fashion, and I don't trust the federal government to do that in an unbiased fashion. But I hope that there is some semblance of justice here on some level. Of course, my whole conversation here ignores the debate about whether or not the operations by ICE are desirable. It ignores many of the constitutional questions, the fundamental constitutional questions that I think too many attorneys especially ignore. I, for one, think that the naturalization clause in the Constitution has been interpreted in a way that is far removed from its original meaning and certainly from the textual analysis or the textualist perspective, I don't think it was ever intended for the federal government to be enforcing nationwide immigration laws. But we are far removed from that discussion. And I'll put up here, I tend to agree with the 10th Amendment Center on issues like this. For those who are interested, they say, Constitution 101 test. What clause of the Constitution delegates a power to the federal government over immigration? Naturalization is a wrong answer. And I tend to agree. I think that naturalization, the naturalization clause within the Constitution has been interpreted much like the Commerce Clause. It's been interpreted in a way to give the federal government broad authority that it was never intended to have. But more disappointingly, even assuming the constitutionality of the operations by ICE has been the Trump administration's response to the situation, as I alluded to earlier. In the aftermath of the Alex Pretti shooting, the Trump administration, Kristi Noem, Stephen Miller, Scott Bessent, Kash Patel, and others really took the language typically used by anti-gunners and used it here to try to, I think, deflect from criticism of their immigration policies. And I'll link to some of these comments. Most of you have probably seen these already, but Trump says you can't have guns, you can't walk in with guns. And when asked, what about the Second Amendment, he says you can't walk in with guns, which is clearly untrue. Stephen Miller made an even more bizarre and extreme statement. He said a domestic terrorist tried to assassinate federal law enforcement, and this is your response? Did you see an attempt to assassinate federal law enforcement in any of that video? I didn't see that. Kristi Noem, I don't know of any peaceful protester that shows up with a gun and ammunition rather than a sign. This is a violent riot when you have someone showing up with weapons and are using them to assault law enforcement officers. Again, I think a gross exaggeration of the facts. Maybe Pretti assaulted the officer. Assuming he did, he didn't use his firearm in the commission of that assault. He was simply carrying it concealed. Department of Homeland Security here, and I'm reading from their X posts. I'll put this up on the screen as a matter of fact. At 9:05 a.m. Central Time, as DHS law enforcement officers were conducting a targeted operation in Minneapolis against an illegal alien wanted for violent assault, an individual approached a U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun, seen here. The officers attempted to disarm the suspect, but the armed suspect violently resisted. More details on the armed struggle are forthcoming. And I'll skip this part, but it says, this is the important part that I want to talk about. The suspect also had 2 magazines, okay, and no ID. This looks like a situation where an individual wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Again, I think this is just irresponsible messaging. First of all, it doesn't matter that he had 2 magazines. Many people, law-abiding citizens who carry on a daily basis, carry extra ammunition. Nothing about the firearm that he was carrying says that he intended to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. This appears to be a standard 9mm 6-hour firearm. He's got an optic on it and a threaded barrel, but none of that matters. Kash Patel, you cannot bring a firearm loaded with multiple magazines to any sort of protest that you want. It's that simple. You don't have the right to break the law and incite violence. The second part of his statement is true. You don't have the right to break the law and incite violence. But the first part, you cannot bring a firearm loaded with multiple magazines to any sort of protest that you want. Apparently, some memo went out that said, use all anti-gun talking points that you can to disparage Alex Pretti. And like I said, I have no particular sympathy for the protesters here or Alex Pretti in particular. It was a tragic situation. He should not be dead today. But yes, it was partly due to some mistakes that he made, significant mistakes, but also due to some mistakes that these ICE officers made. And whether or not those mistakes were reasonable, I think, is yet to be determined. Janine Pirro, if you bring a gun into the district, talking about D.C., you mark my words, you're going to jail. I don't care if you have a license in another district, and I don't care if you're a law-abiding law owner somewhere else. You bring a gun into this district, count on going to jail and hope you get the gun back. I mean, these are just horrible anti-gun statements. And thankfully, I think the administration has backtracked a bit on some of these statements, but these were a classic case of how not to handle the situation. U.S. Attorney Escalation, if you approach law enforcement with a gun, there is a high likelihood they will be legally justified in shooting you. Again, just terrible perspective here. And even Andrew Branca here, who I appreciate his analysis. He is excellent on use of force analysis. But even he uses some of the language here from anti-gunners. The firearm matters and the media is hiding it. At the Minneapolis Border Patrol shooting, the suspect was armed with a Sig Sauer P320 AXG Combat, a high-capacity 9mm pistol with a threaded barrel, extended 20 to 21 round magazine, and a Sig Romeo optic. A setup costing $1,500 to $2,000. This was not a cheap carry gun. Again, none of this matters. And it was not high capacity. These are standard capacity magazines that come with these firearms. So I've made my point here. I want to finish with some comments from Tom Gresham and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has, I know, fallen out of favor with many folks. I don't always agree with her, but I think she makes some good points here in the aftermath of the Alex Pretti shooting. First, Tom Gresham, my overall take is that everyone screwed up. I focus on three things. Number one, although it was legal, and here he's referring to Alex Pretti carrying the firearm, I think it was stunningly bad judgment to go to a super overheated conflict zone with a gun. My training and experience drive me to avoid such places. Number two, I don't know what actually happened to cause him to be shot. I think more info will come out, but at this time we are getting AI images and other nonsense. I'm waiting to form an opinion. Number three, the messaging from the administration people is terrible. Saying carrying a gun and 2 magazines means he was there to murder officers. He had it coming because he was wearing a gun position stands in conflict with the Second Amendment. I think smarter people in the administration are trying to claw back those comments, but it does reveal how little they know about legal concealed carry and the depth of their contempt for self-reliance. I couldn't agree more with all of those statements. And then finally, I'll close with this comment from Marjorie Taylor Greene. While you are being gaslit by the political industrial complex all over social media and the news telling you what you are supposed to be outraged about, think about this. Republicans funded the refugee program by nearly $6 billion of your tax dollars in the DHS appropriations bill, even though you have been losing your mind about paying for refugee funding while you discovered all the Somalia fraud. And the DHS appropriations bill funds all of Homeland Security, including ICE. Now you have watched a shooting video probably over 30 times trying to figure out what happened while a near civil war is being fueled in Minnesota. But look past the hype and focus in on the granular details. The DHS bill funds both ICE and refugee programs. The DHS bill funds doubling H-2B visas and deportations at the same time. Do you see how the Uniparty in Washington funds both sides and then gaslights you and drives you to hate each other? It is all manufactured to drive your outrage, and that is how they make money. When the American people stop being baited into fighting each other, the American people will defeat the political industrial complex that divides us all and can work to truly put Americans first. All right. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you learned a little something. Like I said, I couldn't provide you with a clear answer here about whether or not the um, shooting here was justified. But I hope you have a better understanding about what the analysis is, what standards will be applied as more evidence becomes available. And like Marjorie Taylor Greene said, I hope you can step back and gain some perspective here, because I think on both sides, the government is not our friend. In Minneapolis, of course, politicians are drumming up these riots, providing fuel for the fire, so to speak, and vice versa. I think that there's political theater on the right as well. And I think that all of it is in opposition to our rights, to liberty, to small government, and to a prosperous future. If you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you can share it with a friend, we always appreciate that as well. It helps us get out the message, spread the message of liberty. As always, you can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, X, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms, and at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.